all in all, the divorce really defined my life because it taught me hard work. It taught me a lot of perseverance. And it's ultimately how I ended up working in a Chinese restaurant, which really defined my career.
The Honorable Rabbi Mitchel Silk is a fascinating figure, combining his roles in international finance and sustainability with deep cultural and religious commitments. As a frum Jew and a rabbi, Rabbi Silk brings a unique perspective to his work, including his tenure as the Assistant Secretary for International Markets at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He was instrumental in significant trade negotiations and economic strategies. He has a few wild stories, a few with the president. And this episode was recorded on October 8th of 2023, and we held off from releasing it until now. In this episode, you will hear about the way software technology is helping businesses work 10 times more efficiently, of course, with our friends at BitBean, why Twillory is the best clothing for spring and summer, and how a new Siddur by Mosaic Press transformed my personal davening. This episode is in memory of Shimon David ben Yaakov Shloime, as well as Miriam Sarah Bas Yaakov Moshe. Here we go. I'm Yaakov Langer, and you're listening to Inspiration for the Nation. Okay, I am honored to have the Honorable Mitchel Silk here today. I don't think I've ever had a guest that was called Honorable. Who gave you that title?
It's a title that I insist that people not call me, but
Okay.
it's actually statutory and according to State Department protocols. So when one is confirmed by the Senate, which I was for my statutory position that I served in, which was the Assistant Secretary of International Markets at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, in the United States for life, one is referred to as the Honorable.
Is it a felony not to call you the Honorable? Will I be going to jail? I
think that if you do, I will kick you under the table. How's that?
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
I actually spoke with a good friend of mine who was similarly confirmed for a position as general counsel of one of the cabinet agencies, and he told me that according to State Department protocols outside of the United States, the title is His Excellency. So I don't want to bang into the microphones, but if you wanted to call me His Excellency, you'd have to, kind of
do a bow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But let's skip the formalities.
Yes. Okay. So we're gonna get to your position in the government, but before then, you had maybe a little of an unconventional childhood. Could you tell me about your childhood? And I heard that your parents got divorced and how that had an impact on you in your life.
Yeah, so it's the only childhood that I knew and know. So I actually feel like it was very conventional when I look back on it. It was certainly had its challenges, but I was born into a very ordinary, simple, middle class Jewish family in suburban Chicago. We were a couple of miles outside of the city. Just one block over from Skokie, and I actually went to school in Skokie, and grew up surrounded by my maternal and my paternal grandparents, who for sure had the most profound impact on my life. And when I was 11, we moved from Chicago to Florida, which was pretty wrenching. I really didn't want to leave Chicago and all my friends and all of our relatives. And then within a year, my parents divorced. And so that was pretty challenging. My father returned to Chicago, so I saw him only a couple of times a year. And looking back on it, it had its share of challenges, but all in all, the divorce really defined my life because it taught me hard work. It taught me a lot of perseverance. And it's ultimately how I ended up working in a Chinese restaurant, which really defined my career through serving as a partner in big law I was a lawyer for 30 years, and was one of the key factors in my being chosen to be asked to join the last administration.
What was the connection between, your parents get divorced and now you're ending up working in a Chinese restaurant? How did that come about?
It was pretty simple. I felt that I needed to go out and make some money if I wanted spending money, and if I wanted to help my mother. I had a couple of friends that had just moved into our neighborhood across the street from Hong Kong. It was a family of 5 kids, 3 of whom were boys in my immediate age group, one my age, one about a year older, and one about a year younger. Their family had a Chinese restaurant, and they offered me a job. I started out as a dishwasher and a prep cook in the kitchen, graduated to busboy, and then later to waiter. I quickly realized that if I wanted to excel, I really needed to learn the lingo. And so...
Isn't that like the hardest language to learn? Or up there as one of the hardest?
I think that's a pretty broad misconception.
Oh, really? Chinese is easy?
Linguistically, there are, I think, 468 sounds totally in the language, give or take. It's been a while since I looked that one up. We could check it with Rabbi Google. But it's a monosyllabic language that has a limited number of consonants and a limited number of vowels and a limited number of combination of vowels and consonants, vowels alone, consonants alone, by the 4 tones in Mandarin. So there's a very finite number of sounds that you need to pronounce, unlike English, which has almost 3,000 sounds. So to learn how to pronounce Chinese is actually not that difficult. I actually taught 1st and 3rd year Chinese when I was undergrad at Georgetown. So I would say not so hard, certainly not as hard as a Romance language.
Okay, so you realize that to be successful there is you got to learn the lingo. So how'd you do it? Rosetta Stone existed then, or you?
No, nothing existed. There was maybe a booklet or two. You'd kind of, there was no internet. So the way that I learned was just drove my friends crazy, asking them how to say this, that, and the other thing. I'd get it right sometimes. Most of the time I wouldn't get the pronunciation right, so I'd be saying something completely wrong. Within a year, I was fluent in the Chinese that I was being taught. It was a little bit of a rude awakening. About 3 years in, I realized that the dialect that I was being taught, and there are 8 major dialects in China, was a dialect that was limited to the most southeastern province in China called Guangdong, typically referred to as Canton, Guangdong province. That is the dialect that was spoken when I was learning the language in the 70s by probably 95+% of the Chinese population in America, because traditionally all of the immigrants that came in the 1800s to work mainly on the railroad and other areas came from the Guangdong province. But there are only 5% of the population in China that speak Cantonese. And so it was a little bit of a rude awakening. I came to the realization that if I really wanted a career in anything to do with China, that I had to learn Mandarin. And it was in 1979 that I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, which has intensive language training programs. Really great. They have Hebrew. I think they even have Yiddish now. You go for 9 weeks in the summer. You have to sign an undertaking before you start that you'll only speak the language that you're studying, nothing else.
You're not allowed to talk other languages?
No, you can also, when I went, I could only speak Mandarin, which was a little bit difficult because I was in the first year. I spoke Cantonese, but I couldn't speak Mandarin. As you get on, you learn the basics and you get by, but it was a very, very effective way of learning. And so I covered an academic year of Mandarin Chinese in 9 weeks. And then from there, I went to Taiwan, to the National Taiwan Normal University for a year, where I studied and basically perfected Mandarin.
At that time, were you thinking in Mandarin or dreaming in Mandarin? I'm always fascinated when people are learning
I was for sure thinking in Mandarin.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you ever think in Mandarin now, or not really?
When I was on the job, working in China, negotiating complex contracts directly in Chinese, yes, I would think in Chinese.
Interesting. Okay, fine. So
I would sometimes think in Yiddish as well in the middle of those negotiations when I really didn't like what the other side was saying.
Right. Well, so you Yiddish was what your grandparents spoke, and you had that in your house?
Yeah, my parents did not speak Yiddish at home. I was not fluent in Yiddish growing up, but I learned a fair bit growing up, and then I subsequently spent some time and worked hard at getting Yiddish under the belt as well.
If someone who sees you walking down the street now, they're like, okay, grew up in Chicago. Maybe he went to, I don't know what the elementary yeshivas are there, but maybe they think, oh, he went to Tells. But you didn't. You went to public school.
Yeah, I went to public school. I went to public school and I attended Hebrew school in the afternoons. And on Sunday, Shabbos, we would go to shul at the Hebrew school, but it was a school that was run by Rabbi Hecht and his wife Oliver Shulam in Skokie, which was just a couple of blocks away from us.
I find it interesting, and we'll get to the Kedushas Levi and the Sefer you put out, but I find it interesting that like someone who attended public school goes ahead and spends, I'd imagine, many years of your life putting out the Sefer and translating it so well. It's pretty cool. It gives, I think, a lot of people hope that, they're watching this. They're like, hey, I didn't grow up as from or Orthodox, and what could I really put out? Not saying that you didn't grow up Orthodox, but you didn't grow up in the traditional yeshivas where you're looking and studying and reading Hebrew all day.
I had a very characteristic upbringing in so many respects, and that's what makes me what I am today. Some people call it a little bit of an anomaly. I call it odd, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But I'm actually very happy that I had a diverse childhood, diverse upbringing.
So as you're getting older, did you have a desire to work in the government, or did that just happen after a few series of events?
It was, I made a very, I've talked about recently 3 30-year projects of mine that have come to fruition. One of them was my job in government. The other was the completion of this Sefer project, the Kedushas Levi. And the third one was, we had Neinikel recently, so that was a 30-year project with one of my kids.
Mazel tov.
So the 30-year project relating to my job is a good one, Yaakov. I made a very conscious, I went undergrad to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which is one of the 5 colleges at Georgetown University. It's pretty much a feeder for the State Department. Mm-hmm. And I made a very conscious decision at the time that I was not going to take the Foreign Service exam, and I was not going to enter into the State Department only to work in a desk job, in a consular position, at some locale somewhere around the world, which I'm sure would have been very, very interesting, and then, fight or claw my way up the ranks. I decided at the time that, yes, I did want to serve our great country, but I wanted to have a profession. I chose law, and that as I had gained, as I anticipated to gain expertise in some area or areas, that later in life I would seek an appointment. And it took 30 years. It was very, very, very much a story of hashgacha on so many different levels, a story of divine providence. But it worked out, and the providence is really on a couple of different levels. One of them is on the level of language and culture. So who would have thought that getting a job in a Chinese restaurant would have defined my career, which later would have made me attractive to the government? But I built my career in law primarily around doing transactions in or related to China. I lived in Greater China for 15 years, most of those in Hong Kong, but I also spent some time in Taiwan and on mainland China.
Could we pick that apart just a little?
Sure.
What was the reason for moving to Hong Kong? And were you married at the time?
I was married at the time. We went in 1992.
When I was born.
Yeah, and
Acklingers in New York, we got to get out of here.
so it was an interesting time in the law. I had a great job at a Wall Street firm, and in the very early 90s, so I was doing mainly banking and finance work. some corporate work. And in the early 90s, two of the largest economies in the world opened up to foreign investment in energy and infrastructure. One of them being China and the other being India. Certainly the two largest markets for energy and infrastructure in the world, even today. And I was fluent in Chinese. I was not working in energy and or infrastructure. I'd done a little bit of work in project finance, which is the area of finance that's most utilized in financing large capital-intensive energy and infrastructure projects, but I was not expert in it. And there were a bunch of U.S. law firms that were well-known in project finance that were following their clients to one or both of China and India. One of those firms at the time was called Chadbourne & Park. They've since merged and are now called Norton, Fulbright and Norton or something. They were following some of their very large corporate clients, power developers, financiers, to Hong Kong so that they could service their needs in China. And the firm was doing a little bit of India work out of the Hong Kong office as well. And they needed associates. It wasn't as if there was a drove of mid to senior level associates that were both fluent in Chinese and also knew project finance well. I got a call from a headhunter. I took the call. I took the interview. Interview went smashingly well. And then they got to the point of asking me, so what experience do you have in the power sector and in project finance? And I said, well, I did one or two project deals before, and I've been dutifully paying my Con Ed bills for about 15 years now. So that should mean something. I got the job. And that's what took me to Hong Kong.
Hold on. It was like an easy, like you tell your wife, oh, by the way, I got a great job. She's like, great, where is it? It's like, how long is the drive? You're like, well, we have to take a flight there and live there.
So I knew that I was, I knew and my wife knew what we were applying for. We didn't have kids. And I knew that there was a solid Jewish community in Hong Kong. I'd traveled there, spent time there, and I did spend a lot of time thinking about whether to go or whether not to go. I consulted a couple of rebbes at the time, which is an interesting story in and of itself that would take far much longer than we have today. Mm-hmm. But it was very interesting. The day before I had to give my response to the firm, I was waiting and waiting and waiting for a response from a particular rebbe. It didn't come in. And I decided to take a drive and visit with another well-known Hasidic Rebbe that I knew. He gave me a bracha to go, and when I got home, my wife told me that the other Rebbe that I had this question with for probably 3 or 4 weeks at that point rang and gave a bracha to go.
Oh, okay. I was getting a little very worried that he would say, don't go. Now all of a sudden you have to make the decision. I have an interesting question, and I have no clue what the answer is going to be. And you probably didn't anticipate it because we didn't plan this, but was there any component of you looking to move to Hong Kong because of, I guess, the split of your parents and your upbringing, and I guess you living in Chicago, so comfortable there, and then getting thrown to Florida, which you didn't really want to go? Was there a component of you saying
it wasn't running away from anything, if that's what the question is, but you're asking and I'm thinking and I'm saying to myself, there are a lot of people that I knew then and that I certainly know now, many more people who are very anchored in a community with large families. I think had I been a part of a larger, anchored family and community unit, or community, family unit or community, the decision might have been harder. Mm-hmm. But I didn't feel as if going was an escape. I actually felt it was quite natural because it was allowing me to combine my interest in China with the law in a way that I wouldn't be able to do in the States.
What was life living as a Yid in Hong Kong like? Or Taiwan?
I think of every day as being a great day and a great life wherever I am. I have to say that I had really, really great years in Hong Kong. Very fulfilling years in terms of Yiddishkeit. I had a daily shir, an hour before davening. There were, of course, every Jewish community has to have at least 3 minyanim, right? So there was more than 1 minyan to choose from. I davened primarily in Chabad, in Hong Kong with Rabbi Mordechai Afson, he and his wife have dedicated their lives to the Hong Kong community. They're great people. And so I was part of a nice shul, a nice community. But there are two parts of Hong Kong life, Jewish life at the time, that really made it daily life fulfilling and rewarding. One is the composition of the community. So there were core people that lived there, that lived in Hong Kong, mainly expats, most of whom were professionals, some of whom did trading. But then at the time, Hong Kong was the focal point for China. So anybody doing business with China would travel to China through Hong Kong. So any day of the week, and particularly Shabbosim, you would have anywhere from 10 to 20 on the low end to 200 visitors.
Wow.
From all walks of Jewish life, every degree of spectrum of hashkafa, from left to center to way right of center. Every single ethnicity that you can think of, from every version of Sephardi, whether it's North African, Middle Eastern, every Hasidic group, and then some, modern Orthodox. And on Shabbos, it was just a great, diverse group of people to be with. We had an open house. We would frequently invite people over, and my older kids, I think, benefited from that immensely. The second dimension is that, who needed another Joe, another Moshe in Manhattan, which is where I was living prior to going to Hong Kong, let alone Brooklyn, right? But in Hong Kong, there was a need for leadership. And so I had 3 not small communal responsibilities. I was gabbai in one of the shuls. I served on the Jewish Benevolent Society. There were 3 of us running that society, which was the charitable arm of the Hong Kong Jewish Trust, which at the time had over $300 million in assets. I think at the time it was the wealthiest pool of communal funds of Jewish communities in the world. And thirdly, and this was the most meaningful to me, I served as Gabbai of the Hefer Kedisha for 13 years. Oh, wow. So if you even thought about dying in Hong Kong, you had to go through me.
Wow.
The cemetery in Hong Kong was consecrated by the first Jewish governor of Hong Kong in the 1800s. At the time I was there were between 200 and 300 people already buried there, some of whom had very interesting lives. There was a lot of historic richness in the history of the cemetery. And I completely oversaw the design and renovation of our chapel and our Tahara facility, and then personally attended to every case where somebody passed away in Hong Kong or in southern China.
The middle thing that you said is divvying out from the $300 million. I don't know if I got that right. Is there a key to doing that successfusly? It's a lot of money. And I know and we'll get to the deals that you've dealt with, that like $300 million is like a penny comparatively.
Yeah. So just want to distinguish, there was a group, and there still is a group of trustees that ran the trust. Mm-hmm. And looked after all of the spending. I was not one of those trustees. I looked after, along with 2 other people, a charitable arm that gave grants and loans, interest-free loans. And so is there an art to it? It was not an easy job. And the work that I had done as a pro bono lawyer prior to going to Hong Kong served me well, because I was able to do the research and reach out to a bunch of administrators of similarly situated funds in the United States to assist in drafting the standards that we would use for the review of every application that came to us. It was not an easy job, very weighty job to make the decisions, and all the more harder when some of the cases, if not most of the cases, were coming from people in a relatively small community who you invariably knew.
That's rough.
But interestingly, I can say that the work that we did changed people's lives in a very, very good way. And some of those people, probably now 30 years, 40 years later, are still in touch with me.
Wow. Yeah, making a lot of great relationships that way. We'll be right back this week's episode, but first, let me tell you about my new favorite Siddur. The only problem that I have with the Feigenbaum Teen Siddur is that it's being marketed to teens. And don't get me wrong, your teenage child should get the Siddur, but you should get it too. I've been davening for, 30 years, and I'll be honest, it can be challenging to connect to some of the words. And what I love about the Feigenbaum Teen Siddur is that it is formatted in a way to actually make you pay attention to the words. And what's golden about it, it also gives you like a little English short readable heads up before each tefillah passage. So if you're looking to upgrade your weekday davening, I highly recommend you get the Feigenbaum Teenage Siddur. You can get it at mosaikapress.com. There'll be a link in the show notes if you want to go ahead and click it and buy it. And of course, you can get it by any of your local farm stores. And for larger wholesale orders, you can contact the team at 516-757-5701. You can give them a phone call, or you can send an email to the Rabbi yfeigenbaum@gmail.com. And trust me, get the Siddur and take your tefillah to the next level. If you've seen me davening in the past 3 months, maybe 2 months, you've seen me davening with the Siddur during the week. And honestly, I could say it has made the biggest impact on my davening more than any shiur, anything. It's just the practical way this has been made and just the ease to use. Could not stop recommending the Siddur. People come over to me because it happens to be a very pretty Siddur also, and I'm telling them to go buy it. So I'm telling you, go ahead and go pick it up. Now back to this week's episode. Is there a particular guest? I mean, you had so many people that went through Hong Kong, passed through. Is there a particular person that you remember that made it? I'm sure there's a lot of people, but is there one person that you could think of that made a big impact in you and your family?
I'm not going to give you one. I'm going to give you a couple of groupings and some specific people, and I'm divided into 2 groups. There were Rabbanim and Rebbes, and there were Balabatim. We had a lot of Rabbanim and Rebbes that came when I was there. I had the great schus to be very close with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the chief. Adin Steinsaltz was a very close friend of mine from Hong Kong, and Diane Ehrentraub, Oliver Shulam, Diane Berger, who's now in the Manchester Bezdin. Rabbi Lau came once. And so it was a big kuvod, and it was a great way to meet and grow relationships with people who were gedolim. In the former group, I cannot leave out my own Rebbe, the Nadvorna Rebbe, Rav Shlomo Leifer, who lives in Borough Park, who I brought to be mechazik the community 3 times. He came and we had programming during the weekend and Shabbatons with the Rebbe. And it was just beautiful. It was beautiful. I'm very close with the Rebbe. I'm with him every day. To be away from him was difficult for me for 13 years, but it was so great to have him in my house for the couple of days that he would come. In the second group, and I think this is what you're more referring to, are the Balabatim that would come through, and there are way, way too many for me to name. It was the people that came regularly that I became really, really close with, that I still have very close relationships with today. I have 2 brothers, I could call them, who live in Montreal, who used to come for extended periods, Reuven Mandelkorn and Morty Stern, who live in Montreal. We became the closest of friends. We would have never met each other had I not been living in Hong Kong. And there is one person in particular that came to mind when you asked the question. And I think that of all the guests that would come regularly, that I had the great schus to get to know and be close to, I would probably put the number 1 slot on a couple, but the husband of which is named Yitzchak Ganevish, Rabbi Ganevish, who lives in Montreal, and his lovely wife, Leah. They are extraordinarily successful in the jewelry business, even more successful in Kodesh. They run a number of moistas. They've grown a massively large, exceptional family, all of whom are following in their parents' footsteps of being successful on the professional business side and also doing great things for the community. And I have very lovely and warm memories of spending time with them when they were in Hong Kong. And actually, we had a family wedding. I have two brothers-in-law in Montreal, and so we went up and spent a little time with my wife and our three youngest children with the Kedushas in Montreal a couple of years ago, and it was nice to have them get to meet the younger crop. They knew the older crop from Hong Kong.
And it's also interesting because like you're typically, I guess, more of the host for them. Now you're kind of more of the guest in Montreal.
Yep. And we had a very open table. It was not uncommon for us to have anywhere from 8 to 10 guests every Shabbos, and that was a great part of the life.
What do you miss the most about Hong Kong?
I do miss the community. It is people don't think of Hong Kong as a beautiful nature spot, but the interesting part of Hong Kong is that whereas everything that we typically see as the business district, it's basically the central business district, give or take. Over 40% of the land in Hong Kong are country parks. They're like federal reserve parks. And so there are hundreds of kilometers of paths that you could hike on. You could go out every weekend and not finish all the paths. So very frequently Sundays we would take the kids out, explore waterfalls that were so accessible. There was, typically it was a 15 or 20 minute car ride to the trailhead. The farthest would be 40, 45 minutes, and you'd be in the middle of beautiful nature. So I loved the community. I loved the nature. And I really had a great professional experience. I mean, I worked on some of the largest, most complex cross-border deals in my field that were ever done.
When you say working on these complicated deals, can you give us a range of how much money is involved? And like a little, again, I don't want to get too complicated with that, but like just give us a little breakdown of what that actually means.
The deals when I was in Hong Kong, the ticket sizes of projects that I would work on were really not less than nine figures in the hundreds of millions. Wow. And the last 5 years, quite frequently in the billions.
Wow.
And every deal that I worked on had a lot of moving parts in terms of the people that were involved, people financing, people developing, people doing contracting for the projects, people providing services. There were some projects I worked on where closings would be completed over the course of a week just because there were thousands of documents to sign, covering sometimes up to 20 or 30 countries.
Were you ever nervous with this position?
No, I was never nervous, but I expended a ton of emotional energy to make sure that there were no mistakes, because there was no room for error. I remember when I got my first job on Wall Street at a firm that's called Hughes Hubbard & Reed. It's still around today. At the time, it was a very well-known Wall Street firm. My boss, then one of my mentors, and I had some really great mentors there, used to tell me, at the time I was billing at like an astronomical sum of like $200 an hour. It was like a lot of money in those days. And he said to me, "Why do people come to us to do board minutes? To do minutes of actions that a corporation has taken? Why should they pay us $200 an hour? Because they know that if we do it, we're going to get it right. And you can't not dot an I and you can't not cross a T." So I'd say that I was never nervous, but rather I was very focused and medactic to ensure that we didn't make mistakes. There was just no room for it.
So at what point, or I would say, what was the reason for you guys moving out of that part of Asia?
In 2000 and it was really a series of events. There was some kind of not so fortunate market trends. There was the great Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, followed by bird flu. And so from like 90, and then of course there was the handover in 97. Nobody really knew what was going to happen when the UK stepped away from Hong Kong. So from like 97, 98, 99, markets were a little bit shaky, certainly into 2000, 2001. I was very, very busy during those years, particularly 99 or 2000 to like 01, 02, on a very, very large restructuring. It was a large Chinese company that had over $6 billion of debt that basically couldn't service its debt and was on the brink of bankruptcy. And so I worked on that project for the better part of 2 years when the market was in a very down cycle. Coming out of that, markets were a little bit unstable. And at the same time, very large Chinese corporates, most of which were state-owned, started to follow the then Chinese government policy to go abroad and invest abroad. Most of the work that I've been doing, almost all of the work that I've been doing until that time, was representing investors, foreign investors going into China. So now we had a trend of Chinese corporates going outbound. And so combination of market trends, some of which were shaky, some of which were growth but outbound, and needs of our family with the kids getting older than the older kids, I decided it was time to come back. And around that time, which was 04, 05, I moved formally back to New York in 05. The firm that I was with, and I was with this firm for 20 years, Allen & Overy, which is one of the very large global elite firms, decided that the firm wanted to pursue a policy to capitalize on Chinese outbound investment by setting up specialist teams in key financial centers where the firm had offices. So our first experiment was New York. I led that. We started out with a team of one. And from 05, which is when I came back, until 17 when I left, I'd grown a team of about 20 lawyers, more than half of whom were pretty much full-time on China matters. And I'd grown a pretty large book of business. The firm then followed with a similar China desk in London, and in one of the offices in Australia and in Frankfurt.
Was that transition difficult for you and your family, going from that life in Hong Kong that you established, going kind of into what you moved to Borough Park?
Originally, we went to the Upper West Side, and I lived there for 2 years. I spent the first 3 months in Borough Park. I came back first to kind of set things up, and eventually took an apartment on the West Side. I just felt that would be a bit easier for the transition, and I really didn't fancy having a 40-minute to an hour commute each way every day. In 2007, when we had the oldest of the young lot, we've got 3 little ones, we decided to move to Borough Park, which is where my wife grew up.
So was it hard for the kids, or easy, I guess, because there's so many of them?
It's like any other transition.
I hear that. So at what point did your work with the government come into play? Was that an idea? Was that a phone call?
Totally, in many ways, totally unexpected. Trump won the election. I had been itching to serve, as I mentioned earlier. I was at the point in my career at Allen & Overy where I was starting to plan my transition out of the firm. The firm has a lockstep system with partners. Once you get to a certain age, you have to start planning a transition out, basically retirement. My timeline was a 2 to 7 year timeline. And as it turned out, this opportunity came up at the early part of my discussions with the firm about what I was going to do. It was probably a year or two premature, as it were. But a very close friend of mine, who was then a partner at Allen & Overy, was appointed to a senior position in Treasury. I mentioned to him that I would be very interested in serving if there was an appropriate slot for me. He spoke to the person who was appointed by President Trump to be the Undersecretary for International Affairs, David Malpass, who later went on to lead the World Bank. And David and my friend Heath Tarbert felt that my expertise in both China and infrastructure finance would serve the Treasury and the administration well, because those were two very key priorities of the administration. And I was interviewed. Pretty shortly after I was interviewed, I was offered a position, which was in the spring. And the vetting process, security, financial, political, took quite a long time. The security vetting and clearance really took the longest time. And so I was not cleared for the job until August. I wanted to have the Yom Tovim behind me before I started. So I actually started in October of 2017.
Were you intimidated at all to do that, or did you feel that your experiences kind of helped you?
I wasn't intimidated by the substance. I mean, I was and I am a subject matter expert. Mm-hmm. I won't say I was intimidated. I was eager to try to understand how things worked in government. You know, a lot of my work as a lawyer was dealing with government agencies to secure approvals for an activity or a project in which a client would have been engaged. I'd never worked on the inside, right? I'd never worked on the inside of handling applications that might come to a government agency. I'd never worked on formulating a policy, ushering it through a decision-making process on whether you go with the policy or not. And if you do, how does it turn out? And then once approved, I'd never been on the inside of actually implementing. And all of that was very new to me. I wouldn't say I was intimidated, but I had a pretty high learning curve walking into the building. I really had no idea what to expect.
Was there a thought on your end to walk into this very high government position and not wear your yarmulke? Because a lot of times in the business world or in the government world, from Yidden, they go and they don't want to bring religion into it, so they don't wear their yarmulke. Was there a thought on your end to do that?
I think it's more than just the yarmulke. It's a look. So, as I've said before many times when asked this question, I have a uniform. My uniform consists, regularly, no exception at all, of a black suit, a white shirt, a tie, and a hat. Okay, I wear this beard and mustache all the time. It's not as if one can take it off. So, I have more than a slightly Jewish appearance, as it were. Every time I walked into the building, I was wearing the uniform, hat and all. A lot of people, I think, looked at it as a fashion statement and said, wow, this person, cares to dress to project a certain image. I, of course, dress because that's the way people in my neighborhood dress. And to me, I won't say that, was there a thought of compromise or not compromise? That's the way that I am. That's the way that I operate. And so that's what I did on a regular basis. And I knew every time I walked into the building, where you have to walk through 2 sets of Secret Service, every time I was walking in the hall in the Treasury Department by a janitor, by a secretary, by an admin person, by the secretary of the Treasury, or walking in the Eisenhower Executive Office building or the West Wing itself, going into the Situation Room, I knew that all eyes were on me because of the way that I looked. And it's even a little bit more than that. When I would be in meetings, which range from meetings with my own teams of career officials to meetings with a career admin person who was running travel or running the front office of some other official, all the way up to sitting in the Situation Room, I knew that because of the way that I dressed and the way that I looked, not necessarily the way that I talk, that all eyes were on me, not just because I was the person speaking, but because I was the person speaking and because I look a certain way. And so that constantly drove me to, you asked the question a little bit earlier, on the job as a lawyer, were you nervous? I was always very nervous. I was always very nervous to ensure that I was getting whatever I was saying right, because I like to be right. But I also knew that I was being judged, right? Consciously or not consciously, right. It was the difference between the opportunity for a Kiddush Hashem and a Chilul Hashem. And I'll give you the extreme of it. I have a really close friend who was a colleague for many years, who in my presence, I'm sure not overtly intentionally, said, we're talking about a meeting, and this guy looks weird. Like, that was the comment about me. So, okay, I mean, I'll take it. Like, you think I look weird, not you, X person. So this is the way that I look. I'm sorry. I can't look any other way than I am. This is who I am.
I guess that is some form of like anti-Semitism, saying that you look weird.
It's from a friend. This was from a friend. So imagine,
right.
Compound on top of compound. I was one of the most senior international financial diplomats of this country. And I regularly held meetings at the ministerial level, sometimes with heads of state throughout Latin America, throughout Asia, and in the Middle East. And I went into those meetings looking the way that I'm sitting here today. And I can tell you, Yaakov, without any question whatsoever in my mind, I think people that I engaged with across the table, who were very senior officials, all respected me for the way that I looked.
That's nice. That's actually very nice.
Some of my favorite stories are coming up with Rabbi Silk. But first, one of the biggest stumbling blocks to a growing business is the lack of communication between its many software applications. And this can eat up productivity, revenue, and resources, which is a killer to any business. And our friends at BitBean can help you cruise right over that problem. BitBean is the Silicon Valley of the Jewish world, creating custom software solutions that increase your productivity, adaptability, and make your business future-proof. Think of it like this. Typical out-of-the-box software solutions such as Google Suite, Zapier, and Slack are like city buses. Their features are like bus stops, and they meet many needs and travel fast enough not to be frustrating, but getting custom software from BitBean is like having your own car. It will take you exactly where you want to go, and you can get there as fast as you want. And even better, BitBean is like having your dream car customized to your exact wishes, which is great for those who have a unique way of running their business. And not only does your software take you where you want, when you want it, it also comes with all the bells and whistles you need. Do you need to scale up your customer management process after drastic growth? Or maybe you want to integrate inventory with accounting so you can track changes over time. BitBean has got you covered. Just one of BitBean's developers can replace an entire team, automating the tasks and processes that eat up your time. One business owner said he saved 7 hours per day using BitBean's custom-built solution. Wild. So if you're ready to fully take control of your business and drive it to the levels of success that you know you can achieve, reach out to BitBean today, and they will help you get there in the nicest car, metaphorically speaking, with their awesome software. Go to bitbean.com today. And again, you're getting for the juiciest part of the episode. But first, I am recording this right after Pesach, and I got stopped by so many people commenting about my Twillory ear suit, my Twillory button-down white shirt, my Twillory pants over Chalamoid, my Twillory polo shirt over Chalamoid. And folks, spring, summer is here. A lot of people like to do spring cleaning. It's a new Zman. Winter is over. Summer's here. You don't want to be sweating your face off. But you probably will, because it's the summer and you want to be comfortable wearing breathable clothing. I highly recommend getting Twillory's amazing clothing. Of course, you're going to get $18 off with the code word INSPIRE when you spend $139. Get their pants. I've had pants. I've had the Amazon pants. We all know those Amazon pants. They're really inexpensive, but they're also, replace the word inexpensive with cheap, because they don't last long and they're very, very warm. They're like, I don't know what, they're like fake material plastic. I don't know. Either way, Twillory has the most yummy feeling clothing, whether you're going on a jog or you just want to, go to a bar mitzvah, you need a nice suit. Go to Twillory.com, use the code word INSPIRE for $18 off. Pants, suits, polos. If you're a guy, they got you covered. You could get your whole wardrobe there at Twillory.com. Now back to this week's episode.
Was there any forms of people poking fun, or more than just poking fun, like, I guess, attacking you because there's this idea that when it comes to Jews and there's money, they hack that, oh, Jews, money. So all of a sudden you have a very public position and it's related to money. Did you ever have pushback?
I never encountered anything like that.
That's nice.
I was dealing with a certain level of official.
Yeah, but even more than that, you're. I'm sure you were in the news a bunch.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, the only reason that I ever suffered challenges of the type that you're talking about were not because of religion, but because I was a political appointee. And in particular, I was a political appointee of President Trump.
Right.
And on day one, that was the case, because it is the case in government. Politicals are treated a certain way, and one can work as hard as they may to be respectful and to work cooperatively with folks. And I found that, being nice and doing all the proper things work with most people, but not all people. And I had some more than challenging moments with folks on the job that I would put in the category of discrimination, but it was discrimination because I was a political appointee.
Which is kind of sad because, even though there's two sides to how people think the country should be run, even if you disagree with the right, the left, whatever it is, we're still in this together. So we should be figuring out how to progress with.
It doesn't work that way.
Right.
A lot of people have agendas. Some have more clearly defined agendas than others. And there are a lot of folks also that are just not up on the issues, but feel that it's their God-given right, and it probably is in this country, to speak their mind. And that's just the way it is.
So you just came out with incredible Kedushas Levi. I mean, you didn't write the original Kedushas Levi, but you came to translate it and expound upon it. And you said this has been a 30-year project.
Yeah.
That's a while to write a book, but there's a lot in there.
Yeah. So just a couple of points of clarifications on attribution and also on the time period. I cannot begin to express, I don't have the words to express the deepest of gratitude to the team that I worked with on this project, some of whom were with me from the very beginning, really teams of translators. So I cannot take attribution for translating this work. I had a team of translators, senior and junior. I had a legion of editors, some of whom did some style editing, a lot of whom did very, very technical editing. And then I was very, very gifted, and I'm extraordinarily thankful for the past 4 or 5 years have worked with the team at ArtScroll to actually bring this to fruition. So there was a whole team at ArtScroll that was assisting as well on the final stages of editing and particularly design layout, some of the content issues that we had to deal with. So that's point of clarification number one. Point of clarification number two is that I worked on this over a period of 30 years. I had a couple of things to do during the day. Typically I would be billing about 2,800 to 3,000 hours a year. For those that do these types of calculations, there are only 8,760 hours in a non-leap year. So that didn't leave a lot of time, on top of the communal work and obviously family.
Right.
And, there were some times where work, went in fits and spurts. And so, I guess I had the pleasure or the burden of needing or having to put the work down for a period of time. So we went through a bunch of stages, but ultimately it took 30 years. And I kind of feel like, yeah, it was a long time, but at the same time, this particular work, which is really a defining work, it's the first time that the Sefer, which is probably the most widely studied classical Hasidic commentary on the Bible, has ever been translated into English completely. So I feel that we really needed the time to figure out how to approach the translation. There were always issues of phrasing, expression, words, sentences, paragraphs. There were periods that we went through of trying to figure out how to frame each of the Torah thoughts that appear. So if one were to pick up the volumes, it's a 3-volume, 2,000-page work, they would see that we spent a lot of time and took a lot of care and attention to creating a title for every Torah thought of the Kedushas Levi that defines what's coming in a broad sense, and then doing a framing sentence or two that kind of encapsulates what's coming in the Torah thoughts, some of which are short, a lot of which are short, some of which are really long. And so it's almost as if we were constructing a roadmap, as it were, to every entry. It took a long time to figure out how to lay out the whole of the project. I had originally envisioned laying it out in a certain way, which is very similar to the way that ArtScroll presents Rashi or their Gemara, which is on a phrase-by-phrase translation basis. Our team, my team, went through the whole trouble of breaking up the Hebrew and the English in phrases, putting them together, only to realize that that manner of presentation really did not work at all, because the translation was not done on a word-for-word basis. It was done on a readability, accessibility basis. And so it was really the wizardry and the genius of Rav Shia Brander, who at ArtScroll, who came up with the present manner of laying out each of the entries, which is on a passage-by-passage basis. There are a couple of sentences of the original Hebrew followed by English. Where necessary, we have provided some unpacking of concepts in between in a smaller font. And then within the actual translation itself, all of the words of the original Kedushas Levi in English are presented in boldface. Where we needed to elucidate with some extra words in English, we've distinguished that as well. So it
sounds like a lot to figure this out.
It was there was so much there that we needed the time, and in a way, let me put it to you this way, Yaakov, we really did need to slow down a lot in order to speed up. And my dream is to create a series of Hasidic classics. I've already completed the next volume that I would like to present. And once we bedded in the Kedushas Levi, we'll start working on that. And few people have approached me with interest in doing other titles as well. And so I hope within the next X number of years, we'll have as many as 10 or 20 titles.
That's really beautiful. What drew you to Kedushas Levi? And for someone who's unfamiliar with his work, what bit of wisdom could you give over? Obviously, I'm asking to summarize a lot in one idea, but just to give an example of some of his wisdom.
So let me start with the first point, first things first, and second things second, sure, on what drew me to the Kedushas Levi. Little bit of a fluke and a little bit of an interesting story in the Ukraine. I was sitting in Hong Kong in the 1990s. I was very eager to continue with my studies, with my learning, and it was easy enough to arrange, and I had regularly a shir. In fact, for more than 10 years, I had a daily shir in halacha. Part of that time, I focused on Gemara, but I wanted to learn more Hasidus. My family comes from a Hasidic stock. My grandfather was connected to the Nadvorna Hasidic dynasty. That's where he was born. He came here when he was 20 in 1920 to Chicago, and I wanted to learn more. I found that the sources were not so accessible to me in terms of the language. And so at the time, there were a lot of good aids in translated English that ArtScroll and some of the older publishers were starting to come out with, but very, very limited amount of that literature was on Hasidus or on Hasidic thought. At the time, and this goes back to the 60s and even before then, Chabad was putting out a lot of exceptional work. some of it in English without the Hebrew and some of it with Hebrew and English together. But all of the work that they were putting out, for very obvious reasons, was limited to Chabad Hasidus. And I kind of felt, well, gee, if we're having a translation of this series, that series, and the other series in Nigla, right, in the more outer learning, areas of learning, why can't we have more available in English in the Nister part, in the more mystical dimensions, inner dimensions of the Torah? So I said, as a young, energetic schnook at the time, I'm going to do a series of Hasidic classics. And the first title that came to mind was the Maamar Mordcha, which is the classic sefer of Nadvorna Hasidus, which is attributed to the Rebbe Mordcha, the first Nadvorna Rebbe, who lived in the 1800s. Passed away in, I think it was 1894. And so I worked with one of the translators who's been on my team since the beginning. It's a relatively short sefer, not so challenging in terms of the language. And we got through it relatively quickly, but I came to the realization that other than myself and maybe 10 other people in the world, probably not so many folks at the time would be so interested in having a Sefer Hasidus in English that was from the Nadvorna Hasidus, with all of the greatest respect. And so I thought at the time that if I was serious about this notion, what I really needed to do was come out and inaugurate the series with a title or two that were very well known. So my idea was, I'll do the Kedushas Levi and I'll do the Noam Elimelech. Noam Elimelech, which is attributed to the Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk, is a very, very esoteric sefer. And I came to the conclusion within 6 months or so of working with a couple of translators that we really needed to focus on one project at a time. And that's why we chose the Kedushas Levi to be the flagship, as it were. Now, I had an interesting experience pretty much at that time. In the first trip that I took to the Haim, to my grandfather's ancestral town, I'd been dying to go, the town of Nadvorna, which is presently in western Ukraine, about 150 kilometers south of Lvov. And so in 1995, I took a trip which started in Kiev. We went from there to Nezhin and Gadich, and then down to Berdichev, Mezhibuzh, and then way, way west to where my family was from, up to Przemyśl, Anapol, and back to Kiev. And on the first afternoon that we arrived, we went to Berdichev. There was a rabbi there at the time, Rav Shlomo Breuer, who was sent by the Square Rebbe, and he had a moised, and we had a very warm reception from him. He took us to the oil, which was rather different than it is now. It was a very, very simple building. And all that was inside the very simple four walls was the tzion of the Berdichever. And behind his tzion and the matzeva, there was a little shelf on the wall with what was meant to be in there neshama. It was basically like a glass container, rather large container, with some oil, a couple inches of oil, and a wick that wasn't burning. So I'm coming from Hong Kong, Chaver Kadisha, you have to have a ner neshama, the Berdichever, the holy Berdichever, and the wick wasn't lit. I'm not like a physics guy, right? But you need oxygen in order for a flame to burn. Yeah. There was nothing to hold the wick away from the side of the container. I couldn't get the wick to stay lit. I was very, very upset. I came back to Hong Kong. I had been thinking about this concept of the series, and I said to myself, if I can't physically light the flame of the Ner Neshama at the Kedushas Levi, let me try to light a flame of the Kedushas Levi through other means. And so that's why that was one of the drivers that pushed me to the Sefer. In terms of the second question, what is this Sefer all about? What is this work all about? It's impossible for me to answer on one foot, but I would like to say the following, that it is a work that is characterized by a couple of really fundamental things. Fundamental point number one is that this particular work, which, as I said, is 2,000 pages in English, it's the English and Hebrew together, is an illustration of the extraordinary breadth of knowledge of Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. He was born into a family of traditional Talmudic scholars, and he knew nothing of the Hasidic movement until he was in his 20s. Once he came into contact with the Hasidic movement, he went in very deep. He felt that he could bridge the divide between the very, very black and white world that existed and the world that he saw, which was monochrome, very diverse and bright colors. And that's what typified his life for decades, which was a life for over 20 years of the beginning of his rabbinic career of confrontation and adversity. But he was extraordinarily knowledgeable in Nigla and in Nister. And the one reference point that I can ask people to turn to is the 30 pages of source index that we have at the end of the volume, which is 3 columns on each page. There are tens and tens of categories of Sforim and literature to which he refers. So it's a tour de force of Torah, of Chumash, and other learnings. But the second point, the first one is really would appeal to the scholars among us, yeah? Mm-hmm. But the second point is a far more basic and a far more powerful point, which applies to everybody that would be interested in any degree of bettering themselves and fulfilling themselves. Because on the one hand, the Kedushas Levi, the book, the Sefer, deals with very, very profound and esoteric and deep issues of Brias HaOlam, how the world was created, how the spiritual realms function, what the angels do and what they don't do, right? What purpose do they serve? How do they interact with God and whatnot? It ranges from that, which is some percentage of the whole work, let's call it 20 or 30%, to a whole wide range of very simple and basic Torah thoughts that typify the teachings of the Berditchever, which are very focused on one really simple thing. How can each and every one of us be better people? How can we serve God in a better way? How can we contribute more to the world? How can we be happier? And so a vast amount of the content of the Kedushas Levi is about avoda, about our divine service. And it's a really, really uplifting sefer. It's very interesting that for 30 years, I was in the weeds. And for the last 5 of the 30 years, I was like really, really, really deep in the weeds. And it wasn't until the Shabbos after the Sefer came out, I got my first set physically in my hands on a Friday on Erev Shabbos. And Shabbos in the morning before I went to shul, quiet moment in the house, I sat at the table and I was able to open up the Sefer. It was a Viktor Frankl moment. I felt the tons of pressure of the world lift off of my shoulders. And I was able to actually read, learn, and understand some basic thoughts, of which there are so many that are immensely profound. The one that I looked at on that Shabbos was from Parshas Eikev, not a short shtickle of Torah, that deals with the importance of really, really simple faith when confronted with challenges that might seem overwhelming and even impossible, on the basis that all we need to do is rely on simple faith in knowing that God's never going to challenge us with anything more than we can actually handle. What's the raya for that? You don't see people jumping out of windows, right? Now, the Kedushas Levi doesn't bring that raya down, but the thrust of that Torah basically is one needs to have simple faith. And I can tell you, it's that thought, that exact thought, and other similar thoughts in the Sefer that have been immensely helpful to me in my life and in my work. And I'll give you one example, one very simple example of that. I was the assistant secretary for international markets at the Treasury. On March 27th of 2020, I was gifted a new area of programming, which was purely in the domestic area. Why March 27th? Because that was the date that the CARES Act was passed. Treasury was required by the CARES Act to actually implement major pieces of that $2+ trillion piece of legislation. I got the then 78 billion and later grew into 94 billion piece that was directed to provide support to the airline industry. And I implemented $94 billion of relief over a 9-month period that supported 700,000 jobs for our major and our minor airline carriers and supported service companies. The work was overwhelming. There was no manual. There were no forms. There was no Federal Airlines bank that existed. We started on day one from scratch. We were able to get money out the door in a short number of weeks, and all the airlines survived it. The major airlines survived it. So it was the simple, but very profound wisdom of the Kedushas Levi that really helped me in that regard.
That's really beautiful and pretty wild to think of. Like, I think so many naysayers say like, oh, what is the old rabbis or the old people? What do they have to say that could help us with just the modern challenges that we have? And I think just the simplicity just of whether it's faith or bitachon or just focusing in on what you need to focus in on is so helpful. And I think maybe that's why there's some form of a comeback with even just the world, understanding that there's a lot of technology that we have, but there's certain wisdoms that you can't just make up in 2023.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the word bitachon, because I'm coming to you today very, very tired because I basically haven't slept in 2 nights because I've got two children. 2 of our 8 are in Israel, and they both happen to have or are serving in the army. My son is an enlisted officer. He's been in for a while, and my daughter finished her service about 4 years ago and was called up. I learned after Yontif was out, and is now on a base in her reserve unit. And it's not easy. It's not easy to know that something's going on during a blackout period of a 2-day, Yontif. It's certainly not easy to come out of it to get all of the details, like flooded with way too much media, rather graphic media that I personally choose not to look at. But just to come down to the basics of what happened to civilians, to children, to elderly people, to parents, to me is wrenching. And so I was thinking about it, trying to process and trying to get my head around like what exactly is going on here. And of course, are you going to think, well, what would the Kedushas Levi have to say about this? And I say to myself, I can never be so presumptuous to be able to say to you or anybody, oh, well, the Kedushas Levi, he has this to say about it. But I can, on the other hand, draw a little bit of strength based on my limited ability to process and understand. And I came down to 3 points on approaches or thoughts of the Kedushas Levi that actually have helped me. The most basic of which is that not as much in the Sefer, the Kedushas Levi, although it is a theme, but more so in the very rich lore of stories about the Kedushas Levi. Everybody knows and thinks of him as the great defender of Klal Yisrael, of the Jews, and in particular as the quintessential figure in being able to express the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael, to actually do the mitzvah of loving one's Jew, of loving one's fellow Jew. And of course, at the most basic level, we can't help but to think about what everybody in Eretz Yisrael is going through at this time. And so what better way than to do our piece at the most basic level than to just express Avos Yisrael in whatever way we can with those that we know and are there, even if it's just a short WhatsApp, to show support, to show concern, to show empathy. But that's a simple one. That's a basic one. To move into a little bit deeper, and a little bit more meaningful, I should say. I find a very interesting parallel with the Kedushas Levi himself, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. He started his rabbinic career when he was in his 20s. He had a small shtetler in Richval. He went to Zhelikov, which was a slightly larger shtetler, and then he was in Pinsk. And that was over a period of about 20 years where he was met with confrontation after confrontation, point of adversity after point of adversity. Part of which I think was because he really knew what he was talking about in terms of halacha. He had a great command of authorities, but also because he, as I mentioned earlier, he felt that he could walk the golden mean, that he could be Hasidic and he could be aligned with the emerging Hasidic movement, and at the same time be recognized as a Talmudic scholar. And he succeeded in that. He succeeded throughout the adversity, through that very difficult 20 years. And he all the more succeeded by the time that he got to Berdichev. Some of the adversity continued when he got there, but by the time that he had been in Berdichev for more than 5 or more years, he was recognized and a very revered and loved figure. And that's because I believe that amid the adversity, he didn't pay attention to it. Amid the confrontation, he didn't pay attention to it. I believe that he was just extraordinarily mission-focused on uplifting the next person and ensuring that he could help the next person be a better Jew and a more learned Jew, number 2. And number 3, I found a very interesting thought in the Sefer, which actually deals with war. The bottom line of the Torah thought is that calamity actually strengthens the word that you used before, bitachon, trust. Calamity actually strengthens trust. And the Kedushas Levi points out that there are 2 different types of war. One type of war is a war that he refers to as a milchama pshuta, a very simple war. One country, one folk is warring, is brawling, is battling with another folk of a dispute of some sort, land, whatever. And there's another type of deeper calamity, confrontation, war, that the Eibishter, that God actually brings to us, orchestrates for us in order to strengthen our trust in him and in order to strengthen our faith. One doesn't wish to have it, but I believe that it certainly is a reality. I feel it, and the Kedushas Levi brings this thought out in a beautiful way.
That is very powerful and really sad, but also really beautiful. Yeah, we're definitely davening for your children and just all our brothers and sisters in Israel. Really hope they could make it through this time. I want to finish off with, the question, but 2 things. First of all, I was told to ask you to bring your cufflinks. Those are the official White House cufflinks. Is that correct?
There are a bunch of different cufflinks in the White House and in Treasury, and they've been confused a little bit in the stuff that's been said and written about me. So I actually brought both of them.
Oh, okay.
I have a few different pairs of White House cufflinks, and I have a few different pairs of Treasury cufflinks.
Oh, this is separate. It's Treasury cufflinks and White House cufflinks.
And I'm going to tell you about each of them, but this is probably my most favorite of my White House cufflinks because it is not only beautiful, and it's not only the seal, the presidential seal, but on the back you'll see that the president signed.
Oh wow!
The cufflinks.
Yeah, 45.
And I've got a couple different pairs of White House cufflinks in the Treasury. There are 2 main forms of cufflink. One of them is the silver emblem,
also really beautiful,
of the Treasury. There's also a green one. The senior officials of the Treasury Department actually made their own cufflinks. So the Secretary Mnuchin had his. The Deputy Secretary Justin Muzinik had a pair of DepSec cufflinks, and so I've got both of those. But these silver ones are the ones that I like to wear.
That's really cool. Is there a story that either you heard in your life, or maybe that even happened to you in your life, that gives you chizuk or inspires you?
Oh boy, that's a good one. You kind of caught me off guard.
I don't know how many, because you're very calculated. You're one of the most calculated people I've ever interviewed. I don't know if you get that a lot. No, is that not?
I try to be disciplined in my my communication.
Right. Okay. Well, you are very disciplined. You're honorable. So is there a story, or it's too?
I'm blanking on you at the moment. Not enough sleep.
Could you share a story or two from your time in the Treasury?
Well, we're just finished with the Yom Nurayim. I could think of two really good ones that are relevant to the day that happened in different years, but right around Rosh Hashanah, and actually relating directly to Rosh Hashanah. Interesting, both of them kind of cute. In one matter, which was, I think, in my first year working at Treasury, I was called in to a conference that was being convened with the Secretary, a briefing in one of the compartmentalized secure rooms on an action that the Treasury was considering taking with pretty significant national security considerations. It was not an issue that was directly in my portfolio or in my area, but the options that we had related, or the issues that were presented related to an area of corporate law that I have a lot of expertise in. So a friend of mine asked me to join the meeting. We got in the meeting, very formal, very solemn, big ticket, high stakes issue. Had a briefing, discussed some of the issues. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah. We knew that we were not going to come to a conclusion at that meeting, and so we agreed to adjourn until 8:30 a.m. the morning after Rosh Hashanah. I, of course, was not going to be in, and I traveled back to Borough Park that day. The secretary and the undersecretary that were leading the issue were also not going to be in for Rosh Hashanah. So we agreed to convene 8:30 the day after the Yom Tov. I got back to Borough Park late afternoon. It was my routine to travel home on Thursday nights. I really didn't like to travel on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov. This was an important issue. And I was pretty worked up on the train ride home because of the issue. I really wanted to figure it out. And we went into Rosh Hashanah. I can admit to you, Yaakov, in confidence, okay, that my mind was not wholly there for all of davening. I was a good boy. I was well behaved. I davened. I said all the tefillas. One could say, how much tshuva can one do in a period of, over 40 hours? But I tried hard. But it was very hard for me not to keep my mind off of this matter of high stakes national security. And it was the first morning of Rosh Hashanah. I think it might have even been Shemona Esrei during Musaf, where the answer came to me. And I spent the rest of Yom Tov completely a bag of nerves because I couldn't write it down and I thought I was going to forget it. Lo and behold, we get to the end of Yom Tov. I did remember it. I wrote it down. I got on a very, very early train back to Washington the next morning, arrived at Treasury, went up to the floor where the secure room was that we're meeting in. One of my colleagues was standing outside of the room because we could not bring electronic devices inside of the room for security reasons, and we were waiting for the secretary to come up, and she was leading the matter. And so I told her, Sigal, I came up with this idea. Here it is. And she really liked it. She was leading this issue. We went inside the room. The then General Counsel Brent McIntosh was in there already. And Sigal said, why don't you tell Brent? And I told Brent my proposed fix, and he really liked it. And then the secretary came in. It was very, you would know when the secretary was with you and when he wasn't with you very, very quickly after you started to talk, because he was very quick on the uptake. He came in, we had a couple of introductory remarks. Sigal turned to the secretary and said, Mitch has an idea that he'd like to share. He thinks this could be a potential fix. And so I was feeling, pretty good about things. And I started to talk, and I got into my idea. And I could see within 30, 45 seconds that this was going to be one of those occasions that the secretary wasn't going to be with me. I kind of gave Sigal the look, here we go. And then for about 10 minutes, the secretary proceeded to basically mop the floor with my idea. I think Sigal felt slightly bad because she brought me into this. It was outside of my area. I still contend that it was the right way to go, but the chain of command is the chain of command. Sigal wanted to come to my defense, and she turned to the secretary and said, "Secretary, Mitch spent the whole Rosh Hashanah formulating this idea." To which a secretary didn't miss a beat and responded by saying, "Well, he's got to go back and repent."
Amazing.
And there was a second Rosh Hashanah story, which would have been the year following. My wife and I had the custom wherever I've worked that she would prepare goodies of the day around the holiday period that I would bring in for Jewish colleagues and other colleagues. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, I would always bring honey cakes. My wife bakes a very, very mean honey cake. And I brought a bunch down to Washington on the train, schlepped them down. We had a meeting scheduled for the secretary in his small conference room, basically about the size of this conference room, where there were only 4 officials present, 2 experts in the area, 1 economist that would not meet with the secretary all that often, maybe once or twice a year, myself and my undersecretary. And it was actually on a Middle East issue that we were considering. We were waiting a bit for the secretary to come in. He came in, a little bit of formality at the top. Eyes are on the economist that's going to give his once or twice a year report to the secretary, who is noticeably more than a little bit nervous. Before he had a chance to open his mouth, I piped up and I said, "Mr. Secretary, if I may, I have a really important matter that I'd like to table before we get into the issue." So he looks at me. The other people are looking at me. My undersecretary is looking at me, probably knowing what's coming and ready to kick me under the table. And I say, "Mr. Secretary, my wife has instructed me to give this to you." And it was a beautifully baked honey cake, wrapped nicely in colorful plastic with a bow. And I pushed it across the table to him, and his eyes were just fixated on it. He nodded for the economist to continue reporting. It was abundantly clear that the secretary was not focused on what the report was. About 2 minutes into it, we were sitting in this beautifully appointed conference room filled with antique furniture, including a side table that Andrew Johnson owned, on top of which was his silver cutlery on display. At which point the secretary says, "Guys, I really I want to tuck into this cake. I'm even thinking of using one of Andrew Johnson's knives, of course, which he wouldn't do." And so the economist continued. And after about another 2 minutes of the secretary being fixated on the cake, he says, "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me for a minute." He gets up, walks back into his office, comes back with a knife, and tucks into the cake. And it's almost as if the Rebbe were tailing Lekach on Yantiv. But it was a very nice memory.
So you know what? Let's finish off in a different way. Could you finish off with a Chinese phrase or something in Chinese and then translate it for us?
I most certainly can. I will be very happy to recite a Tang Dynasty poem over 1,000 years old, which is, I think, one of great meaning and significance. And I'm sure that we could find some great Talmudic references, which goes as follows: 白日依山尽，黄河入海流，欲穷千里目，更上一层楼. The white sun sets over the mountain, the yellow river flows into the sea. If you would like to get another 1,000 li miles of vision, if you want to get a view farther out, you need to go up one additional level in the pagoda. Which means that if you want to get a different perspective on an issue or of a point of learning, you need to go to a different vantage point. I had a colleague of mine, a mentor at the law firm, who used to tell me that, when you banged your head up against the wall enough times on a particular issue and you couldn't figure it out, you kind of had to do what people would do with taking a crystal and turning it to see different refractions in the light. You kind of had to turn things around or switch them up a little bit in order to get to the bottom of it. Of course, literally you stand on the second floor and on the 20th floor of a building, you're going to have very different visions. If you look at one particular issue as a 5-year-old and one issue as a 30 or 40-year-old or a 60-year-old, you'll have a different view, and that's what the poem means.
Wow, that's very insightful. And thanks again for coming here and doing this, particularly in this time. And you just turned off your phone for an hour. I'm sure you're constantly looking at your phone to see, how everyone's doing in Israel. And you're honorable. I can't wait to have you when you translate Kedushas Levi to Mandarin. Okay. Very excited about that.
Okay.
I'm joking.
Very big market. Over 1 billion people in China.
Right, exactly. And you know what? Look, wisdom is wisdom. But thanks again for coming out and being on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for listening or watching this convo with Rabbi Silk. If you haven't picked up this Sefer, you can, okay? We will have links on the show notes. Fascinating Sefer. It's fantastic. Go ahead and pick it up. And if you got this far in this episode, please comment the words Kiddush Hashem. As Jews, we believe we're on this world to try and bring God's presence down to this world. And people like Rabbi Silk do that. And it's no surprise that he's so well respected and loved by the folks he has done work with him. So most people don't realize that this is about living l'chaim, but you can help us create the world's leading Jewish content. We are powered by viewers like you. You can donate and inspire millions, of course, tax deductible. We are a nonprofit. Your generous donation enables us at Living L'chaim to share uplifting messages globally, enrich lives, and foster positive changes worldwide. Thank you for opening your hearts, opening your wallets. You go to livingl'chaim.com/donate and sure to share this episode with your family chat on WhatsApp. Your mother will love it. Remember, there's inspiration all around us. L'chaim.
Living L'chaim.